She pressed her hands flat against the leather portfolio and told herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of him, not after everything she had sacrificed to build that list. 7 names, 7 women, 7 months of her life spent finding the perfect bride for a man who never once looked at any of them the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Abigail Mercer had done everything right, and Nathaniel Whitcomb had just crossed out the last name. If you've ever been overlooked by someone who needed you more than they knew, stay with this story until the very end and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this tale has traveled. The 7th name was crossed out on a Tuesday morning in July, when the heat of Boston sat heavy and still over the harbor, and the ink on Nathaniel Whitcomb's desk had barely dried before his pen moved through Eleanor Vane's name with a single quiet, merciless stroke. Abigail Mercer stood on the other side of that desk and did not flinch. She had learned over the past 7 months not to flinch. She had learned not to show the small, precise pain that moved through her chest every time he crossed a name out. Every time another suitable, accomplished, entirely reasonable woman was dismissed without ceremony, without apology, and without adequate explanation. She had learned to hold the portfolio steady. She had learned to keep her face composed. She had learned to say, "Very well, Mr. Whitcomb," and write the rejection in her ledger with the same even hand she used to write everything else. But Eleanor Vane was the last name on the list, and Abigail had no more names to give him. She stood very still. Outside, the harbor moved. Somewhere downstairs, the household staff went about the business of the morning. The grandfather clock in the corner measured the silence between them in slow, deliberate strokes. "That was the last candidate," Abigail said. She did not say it as a question. It was not a question. It was a statement of plain fact, delivered in the same measured tone she used for estate accounts and shipping manifests, and the dozen other practical documents that passed through her hands every week. Nathaniel did not look up immediately. He set the pen down with care. He folded his hands on the surface of the desk. He was a precise man, precise in everything, in speech and in movement, and in the particular quality of his silences, which managed to convey more than most men communicated with full sentences. "So it would appear," he said. "Mr. Whitcomb." Abigail set the portfolio on the desk between them. "I have spent 7 months preparing this list. I interviewed 14 candidates. I researched family backgrounds, assessed financial standing, evaluated temperament and education and social reputation. I narrowed 14 down to 7. I presented each woman to you in good faith." She paused. "You have rejected all 7. I am aware of the number. Then you are also aware that I have fulfilled the terms of my employment. I was hired to identify suitable candidates for marriage. I have identified them. What occurs after that identification is not within my—" "Miss Mercer." His voice stopped her. Not because it was loud. Nathaniel Whitcomb almost never raised his voice, but because of the particular quality it carried in that moment. Something she had not heard before. Something careful and deliberate. Yes, but underneath the carefulness, something else. Something she could not immediately name. He looked at her then, not the way he looked at the estate ledgers with efficient assessment. Not the way he looked at correspondence, measuring every word for what it revealed and what it concealed. He looked at her the way she had sometimes caught him looking at her in the library at night, when he thought she was absorbed in her work, and his attention could rest on her face without being observed. She had always pretended not to notice. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand." Abigail, the use of her given name. The first time he had ever used it in 7 months of formal professional address landed between them like something dropped from a height. She sat down. Howe was quiet for a moment. He rose from his chair and moved to the window that overlooked the back of the estate, where the summer garden had gone slightly wild from inattention. His hands were clasped behind his back. His shoulders were set in the careful, controlled way they always were in company. But there was something different in the line of them today. Something that looked from where Abigail sat like a man preparing himself for something he did not know how to say. "My grandfather's will," he began, "requires that I be married before my 38th birthday. That birthday falls in October. I have until the 14th. "I know the terms of the will," Abigail said. I drafted the summary document myself. Yes. A pause. You are very good at summarizing things clearly. Mr. Whitcomb, if you have decided that none of the candidates are acceptable, we should discuss whether there are other women in Boston society who might be. There are no other women in Boston society. He turned from the window. There are no other women anywhere in this city who would solve my problem. Because my problem is not the list, Miss Mercer. My problem is that I have been writing the wrong list entirely. She looked at him steadily. I don't understand. I think you do. I assure you I don't. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her desk, not behind his own desk, where the formality of their respective positions was enforced by the furniture between them, but in front of hers, so that there was nothing between them at all. Mrs. Hartwell, he said. The first candidate. You described her in your notes as gracious, well-read, and accustomed to estate management. All true. Why did I reject her? Abigail kept her voice even. You said she spoke too little. She spoke exactly as much as was appropriate. I rejected her because she was not you. The silence in the room changed. Abigail stood up. She did not do it quickly or with obvious alarm. She rose from her chair with the same deliberate composure she brought to everything, because composure was the one thing she could not afford to lose in this room, in this house, in this position. Mr. Whitcomb, Miss Aldridge, the second candidate. You noted she was lively and warm and had a talent for managing social occasions. She was entirely suitable. She was. I rejected her because she laughed at the wrong things, because she had no interest in the shipping contracts on my desk, because she asked me nothing at all that required me to think. She was not you. Sir, I must. Miss Fontaine, the third. He was not looking away. His eyes were fixed on her face with an attention that felt nothing like the cool professional assessment she had grown accustomed to. She was beautiful. She was educated. She came from a good family. She would have been exactly what my aunt wanted for this house. I rejected her because she walked into the library and did not even look at the books. You looked at the books before you looked at anything else. When I showed you this house on your first day, the library was the only room that made you pause. Abigail pressed her palms flat against her thighs. You are describing preferences, she said carefully. Aesthetic preferences. Personal. I am describing you. You are describing the qualities you want in a wife, she said. That is useful information. We can use it to refine the search criteria for a second. There will not be a second list. Mr. Whitcomb, Abigail. He said her name the same way he had said it before, with the same quiet weight, the same deliberate honesty that made it impossible to pretend she had not heard it. I have been paying you to find me a wife for 7 months. I have rejected every woman you brought to me because none of them were the woman I was actually looking for. I did not have the clarity to understand that for most of those 7 months. I understand it now. She looked at him for a long moment. She kept her face still. She had become expert over years of working in households where her presence was functional, rather than acknowledged, at keeping her face still. I am your employee, she said. Yes. I am a schoolmaster's daughter with no fortune and no family connections of any use to the Whitcomb estate. Yes. Your aunt has made her expectations perfectly clear. The woman you marry must bring social standing, financial advantage, or both. I bring neither. My aunt manages the household linen, Nathaniel said. She does not manage my decisions. She will oppose it. She will. Boston will talk. Boston talks about everything. It is what Boston does. Abigail picked up this portfolio from the desk. She held it against her chest, the way she had when she first walked into this room 7 months ago. A young woman from Cambridge, who had answered an advertisement in the Columbian Sentinel for a private secretary position, who had sat across from this precise and guarded man and answered his questions about her qualifications with honest competence, who had thought walking away from that first interview that she had found a steady position, a fair wage, and nothing more complicated than useful work. She had been wrong about the nothing more complicated part. I need to think, she said. Said something moved across his face. Of course. I need you to give me time to think about this clearly. You have as much time as you need. He paused. Within reason. Within reason, she repeated. And despite everything, despite the portfolio in her hands and the chaos moving quietly through her chest, and the 7 months of carefully maintained professional distance that had just been reduced to a single conversation, she almost smiled. Almost. She left the study. She walked down the corridor with the portfolio under her arm, and her footsteps even and unhurried, and her face as composed as she could make it, because the household staff was everywhere. And Abigail Mercer had not survived this long by letting her expression tell people things she wasn't ready to say. She went to the library. Of course she went to the library. She sat down at the small writing desk in the corner. Her desk in practice, though it had never been formally designated as such, and she set the portfolio on the surface in front of her, and she pressed her hands flat against it, and she allowed herself in the privacy of that room and the shelter of all those shelved and silent books to feel the full weight of what had just happened. 7 names. 7 months. She had found Eleanor Vane herself. She had spent 3 weeks arranging that introduction, genuinely believing that Eleanor Vane would be the answer. Eleanor was intelligent and capable, and socially established, and exactly the kind of woman who belonged in a house like this, beside a man like Nathaniel Whitcomb. And she had caught herself sitting across from Eleanor at a tea that she had arranged and overseen and facilitated with professional thoroughness, thinking, "He won't choose her either." She had pushed the thought away as soon as it surfaced. She had pushed it away because it was dangerous and inappropriate, and because entertaining it would compromise everything she had worked for. She was not a woman who permitted herself to entertain dangerous thoughts. She was a woman who kept ledgers and drafted correspondence and solved practical problems for practical wages. She was not a woman who fell in love with her employer. She opened the portfolio. 7 pages. 7 names. 7 careful assessments, written in her own handwriting, precise and honest and thorough. She had put everything she knew about good judgment and fair evaluation into every line of every page, and at the bottom of Eleanor Vane's page, crossed out with a single line, was the last name. Abigail stared at that crossed-out name for a long time. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the library, and she recognized them. She had been recognizing those footsteps for 7 months without ever admitting to herself that she recognized them, that she knew the particular rhythm of them, that she could distinguish them from every other set of footsteps in this house, and she closed the portfolio and folded her hands on top of it and waited. He did not come in. He stopped in the corridor outside the library door. She heard him stop. She heard him stand there. She heard the quality of the silence that meant he was deciding something. Then she heard him walk away. She pressed her hands harder against the portfolio and told herself this was simply a problem to be solved. She was good at solving problems. She had been solving problems her entire life. The problem of her father's death and the debts he left. The problem of a woman with education and no fortune and no social protection. The problem of making herself indispensable in a world that preferred to render women like her invisible. This was simply one more problem. She would think about it clearly. She would weigh every relevant consideration. She would reach a logical conclusion and act on it with the same careful composure she brought to everything. She opened the portfolio again. 7 names. She picked up the pen from the desk, and she turned to the last blank page, and she sat for a long time with the pen in her hand and the blank page in front of her, and the summer afternoon moving quietly through the library windows. Then she wrote a single word at the top of the blank page. Not a name. A question. What would you choose if you were not afraid? She stared at the question. She thought about the fact that Nathaniel Whitcomb had stood in his study and told her the truth with the same direct honesty she had always valued in him, even when that directness made her work harder. She thought about the library at night when the house was quiet, and the two of them sat at their separate desks, working in a silence that had never felt like absence. She thought about the books he had left on her desk without comment. She thought about the arguments they had had over estate accounts, sharp and specific and entirely equal. She thought about what it had felt like sitting across from Eleanor Vane knowing. The pen moved. She did not write another name. She wrote, "You already know." She closed the portfolio. She set the pen down. She sat in the library with all those books around her and the summer heat pressing gently against the windows, and she let herself know what she already knew. Outside somewhere in the house, Nathaniel Whitcomb was waiting. And Abigail Mercer, for the first time in 7 months of careful professional entirely appropriate distance, was no longer pretending she did not know why. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room off the east corridor, the room that had been assigned to her on her first day, functional and plain and entirely adequate, which was how she had always described it to herself. And she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about what it meant to know something you could not unknow. She had written 2 lines on a blank page. What would you choose if you were not afraid you already know? She had closed the portfolio and gone to supper and spoken to Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, about the linen order for the guest rooms, and she had eaten her meal and reviewed the week's correspondence and done everything she normally did with the same steady composure she always brought to it. And no one had looked at her twice, because Abigail Mercer was the kind of woman that people did not look at twice. She was competent and quiet and entirely useful. And useful women did not attract the kind of attention that disrupted households. She was very good at being useful. She was considerably less experienced at being wanted. That was the word that kept returning to her in the dark. Not needed, she understood being needed. Her father had needed her to manage the household after her mother died. The families she had worked for had needed her competence and her discretion and her ability to solve problems without creating new ones. Being needed was a transaction. She understood transactions. What Nathaniel Whitcomb had described in that study was not a transaction. He had stood in front of her desk and told her that he had spent 7 months rejecting perfectly suitable women because none of them were her. He had said it plainly without apology, without the kind of elaborate romantic language that would have made it easier to dismiss. He had said it the way he said everything, directly, precisely, with the particular honesty of a man who had decided that the truth was the only thing worth saying. She had not expected honesty from him. She had expected she did not know what she had expected. Something more manageable, something she could file away in the ledger of professional complications and resolve with a clear head and a practical solution. This was not manageable. She rose before dawn and dressed and went to the library, because the library was the one place in this house where she had always been able to think clearly, and she sat at her desk in the gray early light and opened the portfolio and looked at the 7 crossed-out names and thought about what kind of woman she was going to decide to be. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came in at 6:30. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. He was already dressed. He was always dressed early, another of his precise habits, and he was carrying a cup of coffee, which meant he had come from the kitchen, which meant he had not expected to find her here, because he would not have come to the library with only 1 cup of coffee if he had expected company. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept adequately. You're here at 6:30 with the portfolio open. I'm always here early. Not this early." He came in and set the coffee on the edge of her desk. Not his desk, hers, and pulled the chair from the reading table and sat down across from her without asking permission, which was the first time he had ever done that. She looked at the coffee. It was the way she took it. She had never told him how she took her coffee. She had simply always taken it a particular way when it was brought to her, and he had apparently noticed. "You noticed how I take my coffee," she said. "I notice most things about you." He said it without any particular emphasis, as if it were a simple statement of fact. That is rather the point I was attempting to make yesterday. Abigail looked at this portfolio. Then she looked at him. "Mr. Whitcomb, I have been thinking carefully about what you said. I expected you would. I have a number of serious objections. I expected that as well. Then perhaps you would like to hear them." He settled back in the chair. He folded his hands in his lap. He gave her his complete attention in the particular way he had, still and patient and entirely present, that she had always found simultaneously useful and unsettling. "Please," he said. She straightened the portfolio. "First, I am your employee. Whatever feelings may exist on either side of this situation, the professional relationship between us creates an imbalance that cannot be ignored. If I agree to what you are suggesting, there is no way for anyone observing from outside to be certain that my agreement is freely given and not the product of professional pressure." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a fair objection." Second, your grandfather's will was designed to ensure a marriage that would benefit the Whitcomb estate. A marriage to a woman with no family connections and no fortune does nothing to satisfy that intent, even if it satisfies the technical requirement of the deadline. Your aunt will use that argument to challenge. My aunt does not have standing to challenge the will. The will requires marriage before my 38th birthday. It specifies nothing about the bride's fortune. She will find a way. She will try. He paused. What is the third objection? Abigail was quiet for a moment. This was the objection she had lain awake composing most carefully because it was the one that cost her the most to say. Third, if this goes wrong, if you decide in 6 months or 2 years that the practical difficulties outweigh whatever you believe you feel now, I will have nowhere to go. I will have given up my professional reputation and my position and my ability to support myself in exchange for something that could be revoked. I cannot take that risk, Mr. Whitcomb. I am not in a position where I can afford to take that risk. Howe was silent for longer this time. She watched him think. She had watched him think for 7 months across the desk, across the library, across the long dinner table, when he was working something out, and his eyes went to the middle distance, and the rest of his face went still. She had always liked watching him think, which was itself a piece of information she had been carefully not examining. Those are 3 serious objections, he said finally. Yes. The first one I can address by releasing you from your employment immediately so that whatever decision you make is made as a free woman and not an employee. He held up a hand before she could speak. I will pay your wages through the end of the year regardless of your decision because you have earned them and more. She opened her mouth. She closed it. The second objection, he continued, I can address only by telling you that my aunt's opinion of my choices has not governed my behavior for the past 15 years, and I see no compelling reason to begin allowing it to govern them now. Your aunt is formidable. You are more formidable than my aunt. I have observed both of you at close range. I am confident in this assessment. Despite everything, something small and involuntary moved in her chest. She pressed it down. And the third objection, he leaned forward slightly. The third objection is the honest one. The other 2 are practical problems with practical solutions. The third one is about fear, and I think it deserves an honest answer. He looked at her steadily. I cannot guarantee the future, Abigail. I cannot tell you with certainty that nothing will go wrong because I do not know the future any better than you do. What I can tell you is that I have spent 7 months becoming increasingly certain that I am a worse man in every room of this house where you are not present. I can tell you that the silence in this library is the only silence I have found in years that feels like rest rather than loneliness. I can tell you that I have crossed out 7 names, and I would cross out 700 more, because not one of them is the woman who corrects my estate accounts without being asked, and argues with me about shipping contracts, and makes me feel for the first time in a very long time that being honest is worth the trouble of it. The library was very quiet. Abigail looked at the portfolio. She looked at the 7 crossed-out names. She looked at the blank page with her 2 questions written on it, and she thought about the answer she had written to herself in the summer stillness of the evening before. You already know. I need more time, she said. Of course. She looked up at him. A week. He nodded once. He rose from the chair. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, and she saw it again. That thing she had been watching without naming for 7 months. The loneliness behind the precision. The care behind the guardedness. The man her father would have called honest, and her father had been a very good judge of honest men. For what it's worth, Nathaniel said quietly, I already know too. He left. She sat with the cold coffee and the portfolio, and the morning coming slowly through the windows, and she thought, 1 week. I will think about this for 1 week, and I will make a clear, rational decision. She lasted 4 days. The 4 days were in their own way a kind of education. She did not resign her position immediately. He had offered to release her, but they had agreed without quite saying so aloud that the practical work of the household still required managing, and Abigail was not a woman who abandoned her responsibilities on account of personal complication. So she continued working. She reviewed the accounts. She answered correspondence. She coordinated with Mr. Briggs, the estate manager, about the harvest contracts for the tenant farms south of the city. And she watched. She had always watched in this house. It was part of her job to watch, to assess, to understand how things functioned and where they were fragile. But she watched differently now. Without the professional frame around it, without the useful fiction that her attention was purely managerial. She watched Nathaniel with the household staff who feared him a little, but respected him completely because he was demanding but fair, and he paid honestly, and he remembered without being told twice what mattered to the people who worked for him. She watched him with old Mr. Briggs, who had managed these estates for 30 years, and whose judgment Nathaniel deferred to with a genuine respect she had rarely seen wealthy men extend to men in service. She watched him reading in the evenings, always with the same focused stillness, always with his finger moving along the margin of whatever he was reading, making invisible notes on the text. She watched him the way she had been watching him for 7 months. The difference was that she was no longer pretending she wasn't. On the second day, his aunt arrived. Mrs. Lydia Whitcomb was 62 years old and had lived in the east wing of the house since her own husband's death 8 years prior, and she managed the household's social obligations with the same precise authority that Nathaniel managed the shipping accounts. She was a small woman, smaller than Abigail, and she dressed beautifully and spoke in a register of polite authority that made most people feel they had agreed to things before they quite realized they were being asked. She came to find Abigail in the library on the second morning. She did not knock. "Miss Mercer." She came in and sat down in the chair across from Abigail's desk, the chair that Nathaniel had pulled from the reading table 2 days earlier, and she set her hands in her lap and looked at Abigail with the composed, calibrated expression of a woman who had been conducting difficult conversations for 40 years. "I think it would be appropriate for us to speak plainly." Abigail set down her pen. "Of course, Mrs. Whitcomb. My nephew is a man of considerable intelligence and occasionally poor judgment about matters that engage his emotions." She paused. "He has been looking at you differently for some time." Abigail said nothing. "I am not a foolish woman, Miss Mercer. I have run this household since before you were hired. I observe people. It is something of a professional requirement." Another pause. "I have also observed that you are not a foolish woman, which is why I believe you understand, without my having to enumerate the difficulties, what it would mean for this family if Nathaniel were to pursue an inappropriate attachment." "Mrs. Whitcomb, you are a schoolmaster's daughter," Lydia said. Not unkindly, not cruelly, simply with the flat directness of a woman stating a fact she considered relevant. "You have no fortune, no family of standing, no social connections of any use to the Whitcomb name. You are intelligent and capable, and I have no personal objection to you whatsoever. But this family has a position to maintain, and a marriage to a woman in your circumstances would damage that position in ways that would take years to repair." Abigail looked at her steadily. "I appreciate you speaking plainly. I thought you would." Lydia rose from the chair. "I am not your enemy, Miss Mercer. I am simply telling you what is true. My nephew may not be thinking clearly at the moment. One of you ought to." She left. Abigail sat for a long time after the sound of her footsteps faded. She thought about what Lydia had said. She thought about it honestly, without the defensive anger that would have been the easier response, because Lydia was not entirely wrong. The practical difficulties were real. The social costs were real. She was a schoolmaster's daughter with no fortune and no protection, and the world she lived in did not extend much grace to women who reached above their circumstances. She had known all of that. She had known it before Nathaniel said her name in that quiet, deliberate, honest way. She had known it, and she had used it as a wall, and the wall had held for 7 months, and then he had simply told her the truth, and the wall had become suddenly very difficult to maintain. On the third day, she went looking for Nathaniel. She found him in the small office off the main study, where he kept the private shipping records, the ones that dealt with the contested accounts from his grandfather's last years. The accounts that she had been helping him untangle for 3 months. He was bent over a ledger with a furrowed expression that she recognized as the one that meant the numbers weren't adding up the way they should. "There's a discrepancy," she said from the doorway. He looked up. Something moved briefly across his face. There are several discrepancies. She came in. She did not wait for an invitation she never had in this room, because the work required them both, and waiting for formal invitation would have slowed everything down. She pulled her own chair to the side of the desk and looked at the ledger he was working from. Page 42, she said. The transfer from the Savannah account. I noticed it 2 weeks ago. It doesn't match the corresponding entry in the Harbor ledger. He stared at her. You noticed that 2 weeks ago? Yes. Why didn't you say something? I was still verifying. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. She turned the page. Look at the date on the transfer, and then look at this. She reached across him and turned to the back of the ledger to the supplementary accounts that were kept in a different hand. A hand she had been quietly comparing to other documents in the estate records for 2 weeks. Nathaniel went very still. Someone has been altering these accounts, he said. Someone has been altering these accounts for at least 3 years, Abigail said. And the handwriting in the altered entries matches the handwriting in the correspondence from your family's account agent in Philadelphia. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones they had shared in the library. This one had weight and urgency in it. Mr. Fenner, Nathaniel said quietly. Silas Fenner, the family's account agent in Philadelphia, who had managed the Whitcomb financial affairs for a decade, who had been introduced to Abigail at a dinner 3 months ago, with the particular manner of a man accustomed to being important in rooms where other people were doing the actual work. I can't be completely certain, Abigail said carefully. But the evidence is, it's him. Nathaniel's voice was flat and precise and very controlled, which was how she knew he was furious. I've suspected for 6 months that something wasn't right with the Philadelphia accounts. I couldn't find it. He looked at her. You found it. I found a thread. You'll need a proper examination of all the records to establish the full picture. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way he'd looked at her in the study 2 days ago. Something different. Something that was about the two of them sitting over a ledger at 9 in the morning with a thread of financial fraud between them. Working the same problem from different angles. Fitting together the way two people fit together when they are actually built for the same work. Abigail, he said. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to. You were making a face. I was not making a face. You were making the face you make when you are about to say something that you think is significant. I have been watching you make that face for 7 months. She turned back to the ledger. Let's work through page 42 first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes, ma'am. And she heard something that might have been the beginning of a smile in his voice, and they worked through the ledger together for the next 3 hours. In a silence that was not silent at all, but full of the particular language of two people doing shared work. The quick exchanges, the pointed questions, the moments where one of them saw something and the other immediately understood why it mattered. It was the most natural 3 hours she had spent in 7 months. That was the 3rd day. On the 4th day, Abigail went to Nathaniel's study, and she knocked on the door, and she stood in front of his desk, and she said, I have made a decision. He set down his pen. He looked at her. He was very still. Your first objection, she said, the one about professional imbalance. I accept the resolution you proposed. I will resign my position effective today, and we will be whatever we are as equals. Something shifted in his expression. Your second objection, she continued. Those were your objections. Your aunt's objections, she corrected. I spoke with her. I understand her position. I disagree with it, but I understand it, and I believe she will adjust given time and evidence. She will, he said. She respects competence above almost everything. She will come around. I know. Abigail paused. And the third objection, the honest one. She looked at him steadily. I cannot promise I am not afraid, Mr. Whitcomb. I am afraid. I am very afraid of several specific things, and I think you should know that and not mistake my decision for the absence of fear. Then what is your decision? He asked. Very quietly. I think, she said carefully, that I have been writing a list for 7 months and looking at every name on it and thinking none of them are right for him. And I told myself that thought was professional assessment, that I was simply doing my job thoroughly, that my ability to identify the wrong women was a function of my skill and not... She stopped. She pressed her hands together. I have been writing the wrong list, she said. You were right about that. He stood up from behind the desk. He crossed to where she was standing, not quickly, not with any kind of dramatic urgency, but with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to make a conscious effort not to take a step back, and he said, Are you saying yes? She looked at him. I am saying, she said, that I would like to find out if the answer is yes. I am saying that I am not prepared to walk away from whatever this is without finding out. And I am saying that if this is going to become something, it is going to become something between two equal people, and I will not be managed or handled or made into something decorative to stand beside a wealthy man's name. I would not know what to do with a decorative woman, Nathaniel said. I spent 7 months rejecting perfectly good ones. You did. I need the woman who corrects my accounts. Then you should have thought about that before you let her find the fraud in your Philadelphia ledgers, because now she has considerable leverage. The smile that moved across his face then was the kind of smile she had seen him use exactly twice in 7 months, and both times she had looked away before she could examine it too closely. She didn't look away this time. Miss Mercer, he said. Abigail, I would like to court you properly with your permission as a free woman and not an employee. I would like to do this with honesty and without any further pretense about lists or suitable candidates. He paused. And I would like to start by having supper with you tonight in the dining room, not in the staff parlor, because you have been eating in the wrong room of this house for 7 months, and I intend to correct that. She felt something in her chest shift, something large and careful and long-held, and she said, That is a reasonable place to start. Good. I still have serious reservations. I know. Your aunt is going to make this very difficult. I know that too. And Boston. Boston, he said with a firmness that she felt in the back of her spine, can form its own opinions. They generally do regardless of whether they are invited to. Abigail looked at the desk. She looked at the ledger open on it and the thread of financial fraud they had found together and the work they had done side by side that morning. She thought about the library and the 2 desks and the silence that felt like rest. She thought about her father, who had educated her like a son, who had told her the world will try to make you small, Abigail. Your job is to refuse. Supper, she said. In the dining room. At 7, he said. At 7, she agreed. She left the study. She walked back down the corridor and into the library, and she sat down at her desk, and she picked up the portfolio, and she turned to the blank page, the one with her 2 questions written on it, and she looked at what she had written. What would you choose if you were not afraid? You already know. She picked up the pen. Below the 2 lines in the same careful hand, she wrote one more. Then choose. She closed the portfolio and set it in the drawer, and locked the drawer, and put the key in her pocket. Outside, Boston moved through its ordinary July day, loud and busy, and entirely unaware that in a library, in a house on the hill, a woman who had spent 7 months making herself useful had just made a different kind of decision entirely. And in the study down the corridor, she was fairly certain Nathaniel Whitcomb was doing something he very rarely did. He was smiling. Supper at 7 was not what Abigail had expected. She had expected formality. She had expected the careful, measured distance of 2 people navigating a new arrangement with appropriate caution. She had expected Nathaniel to be precisely what he always was, composed, deliberate, controlled, and she had expected herself to match him in that, because composure was what she did, and the dining room was simply a room, and supper was simply a meal, and she was a grown woman who had made a clear-eyed decision and was not going to be undone by a change in which room she ate it in. What she had not expected was for him to be nervous. It was almost imperceptible. She would not have caught it if she hadn't spent 7 months learning to read the specific vocabulary of his silences and stillnesses. But she caught it the way he straightened his cuffs twice before sitting down, the way he poured the water with slightly more attention than the task required, the way he looked at her when she came in, and then immediately looked at the table as though the centerpiece had become suddenly fascinating. Nathaniel Whitcomb, who negotiated shipping contracts and managed a considerable estate, and had told her the truth about 7 crossed-out names without flinching, was nervous about supper. Something in her chest loosened a fraction. She sat down across from him and said, "The centerpiece is the same one that has been on this table since March." He looked up. "I'm aware. You were staring at it. I was thinking. You think at the centerpiece often." A pause. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "It has a convenient location." She unfolded her napkin. "Mr. Whitcomb." "Nathaniel," he said. "If we are going to have supper in the same room, you might as well use my name." She considered this. "Nathaniel," she said, and watched something shift in his expression at the sound of it. "You are nervous." "I am not nervous." "You straightened your cuffs twice." He looked at his cuffs. He looked back at her. "I straightened my cuffs, not twice in 30 seconds. She picked up her fork. "It's all right. I find it reassuring." "You find my discomfort reassuring." "I find that you are capable of discomfort reassuring." I had begun to wonder. She met his eyes and held them. "You are very good at appearing certain about everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So are you." They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that was honest and slightly uncomfortable and entirely real. And Abigail thought, this is what it is then. This is what it feels like when the pretending stops. "Tell me about your father," Nathaniel said. She had not expected that either, she told him. She told him about the schoolmaster in Cambridge who had believed with a stubbornness that had frustrated and sustained her in equal measure that an educated mind was an educated mind, regardless of whose head it occupied. She told him about the hours in her father's study, with Latin and mathematics and philosophy, while the other girls her age were learning embroidery. She told him about her father's death and the debts, and the morning she had understood with absolute clarity that her education was the only asset she possessed that could not be taken from her. Nathaniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the sympathetic noises that people offered when they were waiting for their turn to speak, rather than actually listening. He listened the way he read completely with his full attention, as though what she was saying mattered. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," he said when she finished. "How was the best man I knew," she said. "He was also impractical and financially incautious, and he trusted people he should not have trusted, which is why he died in debt." A pause. "I inherited his mind. I tried to acquire better judgment about money." "You succeeded. The Savannah account discrepancy alone represents Nathaniel." She looked at him steadily. "We are not discussing the Savannah account at supper." Another pause. "No, you're right." He picked up his glass. "Tell me something else." She told him something else. And then he told her something about his mother, who had been a quiet woman, married to a loud and careless man who had loved her children fiercely, and her husband out of obligation, and who had died. Nathaniel believed of the accumulated weight of a life spent performing happiness she did not feel. "I watched her do it for 20 years, he said. "Smile at the right moments, say the correct things, make everything look orderly from the outside. And I thought the only thing worse than a loveless marriage would be a marriage where one person loved honestly and the other performed it." He looked at his glass. "That is why I rejected Mrs. Hartwell." Abigail set down her fork. She seemed content. She seemed practiced. "There's a difference." He looked up. "You have never once in 7 months performed anything in this house. You are exactly what you appear to be every single day. I found that—" He paused. "Remarkable." She thought about all the ways she had worked to be invisible in this house, all the careful, deliberate effort she had put into being useful rather than noticed. Remarkable was not the word she would have chosen, but she understood what he meant, and that the fact that she understood what he meant was itself the problem, and the thing that was not a problem at all, and the entire center of everything. The following 2 weeks moved with a rhythm that was new and familiar at the same time. She was no longer his employee. He had made that formal quietly with a severance payment that she had tried to refuse, and he had refused to take back. She stayed in the house because the alternative was a boarding room in Cambridge, and they had agreed without quite articulating it that they were figuring something out that required proximity. She worked anyway. She could not stop working. It was not in her nature, and the estate accounts were genuinely in need of attention, and Nathaniel had not replaced her, and the Fenner situation was developing in ways that required careful documentation. But the work was different now. It was shared rather than assigned. He came to the library, and they worked side by side, and he asked her opinion, and she gave it without softening it. And he pushed back, and she pushed back harder, and Mrs. Calloway, who had been with the household for 20 years, came to find Abigail one afternoon with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction, and said, "I don't know what has changed in this house, Miss Mercer, but something has. Mr. Whitcomb laughed this morning." "He laughs," Abigail said. "Not like that, he doesn't." Mrs. Calloway gave her a significant look and left. Abigail looked at the account book in her hands and felt warmth move through her chest and tried to decide whether to be concerned about it. She decided not to be. She had made her decision. She was not going to spend the rest of this figuring out period being concerned about warmth. The first serious difficulty came on a Wednesday. Lydia Whitcomb appeared in the library doorway with an expression that told Abigail the pleasant equilibrium of the past 2 weeks was about to be disturbed. She had a letter in her hand. She set it on Abigail's desk without preliminary and said, "Read that." Abigail read it. It was from a woman named Mrs. Caroline Ashford, wife of one of the most prominent merchants in Boston's trading community, and it was addressed to Lydia. It was written in the style of social correspondence, all pleasantries and careful phrasing. But the content was pointed. She had heard certain rumors about the Whitcomb household, and felt it her duty as a longtime friend of the family to raise her concern before the situation became a subject of wider discussion in Boston society. The rumors apparently had already started. Abigail set the letter down. How many people know? Enough. Lydia sat down. She looked for the first time since Abigail had known her slightly tired. Mrs. Ashford is not a malicious woman. She is a connected one. If she has heard something, then the information has already moved further than you might hope. What exactly have they heard? That my nephew has dismissed a series of perfectly suitable candidates in favor of a... Lydia paused precisely. Attachment to his secretary. Abigail kept her voice level. That is broadly accurate. Yes. Lydia looked at her. Miss Mercer, I said what I said to you last week because I believed it was true. I still believe the practical difficulties are real. But I am not a foolish woman, and I have been watching my nephew for 2 weeks, and I am... Another precise pause. Willing to revise some of my initial positions. Abigail looked at her steadily. That is generous of you. It is practical of me. Nathaniel has made his intention clear, and Nathaniel, when his intention is clear, is not a man who changes course. She straightened in her chair. What I am asking you now, Miss Mercer, is whether you are equal to what is coming, because what is coming will not be pleasant. No, Abigail agreed. I don't imagine it will be. Boston society is not forgiving of women who step outside their designated position. They will not see an intelligent woman who earned her place. They will see a secretary who married above herself. I know. It will require considerable resolve, Mrs. Whitcomb. Abigail looked at her directly. I am a schoolmaster's daughter who has supported herself by intelligence and work since the age of 19. I have sat across from dismissive men and indifferent women in every household I have worked in, and I have made myself indispensable without once being invited to. I have considerable resolve, I assure you of that. Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face, something that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. Yes, she said finally. I begin to see that. She rose. I will handle Mrs. Ashford. You handle my nephew. Between the two of us, we may manage this after all. She left. Abigail looked at the letter on her desk. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she folded it carefully and set it aside, and she went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the small office with the Philadelphia ledgers. He had brought in additional records from the past 5 years, the full correspondence between the Whitcomb estate and Silas Fenner's office, and he was working through them with the focused, controlled fury she had come to recognize as the way he looked when something had been done that he considered fundamentally dishonest. How much? she asked from the doorway. He looked up. He held her eyes for a moment, and she saw something hard and resolved in his face. Enough to matter, not enough to be immediately catastrophic, but if it had continued another 2 or 3 years. He was waiting, she said. Nathaniel frowned. What do you mean? She came in. She sat down across from him. Look at the pattern of the alterations. They're small in the early years, barely significant enough to notice. But look at the last 18 months, the amounts increase, but the method stays exactly the same. He wasn't taking large amounts because he was afraid of discovery. He was building a foundation. He was waiting until he had enough small alterations accumulated to make one significant move that would be buried in the existing pattern. Nathaniel looked at the ledgers. He looked at them the way he looked at things when she said something that reframed the entire picture. I was planning to take it all at once, Nathaniel said quietly. Not all at once, but significantly. And by the time you found it, the pattern would have looked like years of minor bookkeeping errors rather than a single theft. The silence was sharp and focused. How did you see this? He asked. Because my father trusted people he should not have trusted, she said simply. And I spent 20 years watching what that looked like from the inside. After a while you learn to see the shape of dishonesty. He looked at her. He set down his pen. He said very quietly, "What would I have done without you?" It was not a rhetorical question. She could hear that. It was the kind of question a man asked when the answer was something he was only beginning to understand the weight of. You would have found it eventually, she said. You're not careless. I would not have found it before October, he said. And in October, under the terms of my grandfather's will, if I am not married, a portion of the estate management reverts to a family council. Fenner sits on that council. Abigail went very still. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at the ledgers. She looked at the dates of the alterations and the composition of the family council, and she put it together the way she put everything together quickly, completely, with the specific chill of a picture coming clear. He knew about the will, she said. He has known about it for years. He helped draft the original documentation. I was waiting for October time, she said. If you were not married by your 38th birthday, he would have had access to the estate accounts through the council. He could have continued the alterations indefinitely with institutional cover. Yes. And the reason you were struggling to find a suitable wife. Nathaniel's expression changed. Something cold moved through it. The candidates, he said slowly. She was already thinking it. 3 of your 7 candidates came through Fenner's professional network. He recommended them. I assumed it was a professional courtesy. But if those women were selected specifically to be unsuitable in ways that weren't immediately obvious, if he knew your requirements and chose women who would fail them, he was sabotaging the search. Nathaniel's voice was flat and precise and very controlled. He was keeping me unmarried on purpose. The room was very quiet. We need to verify it, Abigail said. We can't know for certain without more information about how those 3 candidates were actually identified. I'll find the information. He paused. Abigail, if this is what it looks like, then Silas Fenner spent the better part of a year engineering the conditions for a significant financial crime, she said. And the only reason it failed is because you hired me. He looked at her steadily. The only reason it failed, he said, is because of what you are. She did not look away from that. She let it land. We need to contact the family's legal counsel, she said. Today. Agreed. He was already rising. And we need to do it without Fenner knowing. If he suspects we've found the thread, he'll move faster than planned. Yes. He stopped in front of her, very close. Can you draft the communication to the legal counsel in terms that reveal nothing to anyone else who might handle the correspondence? Of course. And Abigail. He put his hand on arm, briefly, just briefly, with the particular restraint of a man not yet accustomed to being permitted to touch. What you found in those ledgers, what you saw, it changes everything. Not just for the estate, for the will, for October. She understood what he was saying. Without the Fenner threat neutralized, even a marriage would not protect the estate entirely. But with the fraud exposed, the family council's composition and authority could be challenged. The entire structure of the pressure he had been under could shift. "Let's deal with one thing at a time," she said. "Yes." He almost smiled. "In order of importance." "Legal counsel first," she said. "Legal counsel first," he agreed. And his hand left her arm, and she went to draft the letter, and the summer afternoon pressed against the windows of the estate, and Boston went about its business entirely unaware that in this house, two people were quietly dismantling something that had been designed to ruin them both. The letter went out that afternoon. 3 days later, everything broke open. She was in the library when she heard the front door. Not the measured knock of a caller, but the kind of entrance that did not bother with the formality of knocking. She heard voices in the hall. She heard Nathaniel's voice, which was controlled and precise, and another voice, which was not. Silas Fenner. She set down her pen. She did not move immediately. She listened. She could not make out the specific words from the library, but she could hear the shape of the exchange, the rising pressure of Fenner's tone, the flat contained quality of Nathaniel's responses. It was the voice Nathaniel used when he was furious and choosing not to show it, which meant the situation had moved faster than either of them had anticipated. Fenner knew. She rose from her desk and moved to the doorway and stood there. And in the main hall, she could see both of them. Fenner, who was a broad man with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to occupying space in rooms, and Nathaniel, who was still and precise and completely immovable. "This is an accusation," Fenner was saying, "that I will not stand for. I have managed this family's accounts for 10 years. 10 years. And on the word of a hired woman, Miss Mercer is not my employee," Nathaniel said. "And her analysis of the accounts has been reviewed by the family's legal counsel. This is not a matter of word against word, Fenner. This is a matter of documentation." Fenner turned his head. He saw Abigail in the doorway. His expression did something complicated. Contempt was the primary element of it, but underneath the contempt was something that looked very much like fear, and men who were afraid and contemptuous in the same moment were in Abigail's experience the most dangerous kind. "Miss Mercer." He said her name the way a man said a word he found distasteful. "You've done well for yourself. Secretary to what exactly? What do we call what you are now in this house?" She kept her voice completely even. "I call myself the woman who found your discrepancy on page 42. Something flickered in his eyes. "Bold talk," he said, "from a woman with no name, no fortune, and no standing in any room in this city. You understand what Boston will say about this. You understand what they'll say about you." "I understand what the courts will say about you," she said, "which is rather more relevant." Nathaniel stepped forward. Not aggressively, not with any dramatic gesture, but with the particular physical authority of a man who has decided exactly where he stands. "You will leave this house, Fenner," he said. "The legal process will proceed according to the documentation already in counsel's hands. If you attempt to contact any member of the family council before that process is complete, I will consider it an admission of intent and act accordingly. Do you understand me?" Fenner looked at him. He looked at Abigail. The fear in his eyes had become the dominant element now, though he was working hard to keep it out of his expression. "You'll regret this," he said. It came out thinner than he intended. "Show him out," Nathaniel said to the footman. He did not look at Fenner again. Fenner left. The front door closed. Nathaniel turned. He looked at Abigail across the hall with an expression that she had no prior category for something exhausted and resolved. And underneath both of those things, something warmer and more unguarded than he usually permitted himself. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine." He crossed to where she was standing. "Are you?" "He'll tell people," she said. "Whatever version of this story does the most damage to your position and mine. He'll tell it before the legal proceedings can tell the true version. I know. Boston will hear his version first." "They will." She looked at him. "Are you prepared for that?" He looked back at her. "Are you?" She thought about what Lydia had said. What is coming will not be pleasant. She thought about Mrs. Caroline Ashford's letter and the rumors already circulating. She thought about Silas Fenner walking out of this house to go tell a story designed to make her the villain of it. She thought about her father, who had said the world will try to make you small. Yes, she said. Something in his face steadied. Then so am I. She went back to the library. She sat down. She picked up her pen, and she looked at the account books stacked on the desk, and she thought about October, and the will, and the family council, and the legal proceedings, and everything that was in motion, now all of it at once, and she felt the full weight of it settle over her like weather. Then she opened the account book and found her place, and began to work. Because that was what she did. And in the hall behind her, she heard Nathaniel go to the study and close the door, and she heard the particular quiet that meant he was sitting at his desk and beginning to work too. And the house held both of them in its summer stillness. Two people preparing for the same storm from separate rooms, and that was somehow enough. It was 4 days after Fenner's visit that Eleanor Vane came to call. Abigail had not expected that. She had thought of Eleanor Vane as a closed chapter. The last name crossed out the final candidate, the woman who was supposed to be the answer and wasn't. She had not thought about Eleanor Vane in 2 weeks. She had been somewhat occupied. Eleanor was shown into the sitting room, and Abigail, who happened to be crossing the hall with a stack of correspondence, was seen by her before she could make any tactical decision about the encounter. Miss Mercer. Eleanor Vane was a composed, handsome woman of 34, with the particular poise of someone who had spent years being exactly what a room expected her to be. She looked at Abigail with an expression that was not unkind. I was hoping I might speak with you. Abigail set down the correspondence. Of course. They sat in the sitting room. It was the room where Abigail had conducted the candidate interviews, all 7 of them at this very table, with tea and careful questions, and the portfolio open in her hands. She felt the peculiarity of being on the other side of it. I've heard the rumors, Eleanor said. She was direct about it, which Abigail respected. About you and Mr. Whitcomb, about Fenner, about the accounts. She paused. I want you to know that I believe you. About Fenner. Abigail studied her. Why? Because he recommended me. Eleanor's eyes were steady. He came to me through a mutual acquaintance 3 months before Mr. Whitcomb interviewed me. He was very thorough in preparing me for the meeting. He told me a great deal about Mr. Whitcomb's preferences, his requirements, his history. She paused. Looking back, I think he was telling me exactly what I needed to know to seem right for the position. Which means he also knew I would not actually be right for it. Abigail went still. He prepared you to appeal to Nathaniel's stated preferences. Yes, but not his actual ones. Eleanor looked at her steadily. Miss Mercer, I am not a foolish woman. I sat across from Mr. Whitcomb for 2 hours, and I understood quite clearly that whatever he was looking for, I was not it. And I also understood, though I did not have the specific information then, that someone had arranged for me to be there. Someone who needed the search to continue rather than conclude. She was confirming it. She was sitting in Abigail's interview chair and confirming from the other side what Abigail and Nathaniel had already suspected. Will you speak to the legal counsel? Abigail asked. Yes, Eleanor said. That is why I'm here. Abigail looked at her. She thought about what it had cost this woman to come, the social exposure, the acknowledgment that she had been a tool in someone else's scheme. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Eleanor rose. She looked at Abigail with something that was unexpectedly almost warm. I came for my own reasons. But I will say this. Miss Mercer, he made the right choice. Whatever Boston decides to say about it. She paused at the door. Make sure he knows that someone with more social standing than either of you thinks so. She left. Abigail sat in the interview room for a long moment. Then she stood up and picked up the correspondence and walked down the corridor to Nathaniel's study and knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. He looked up. Eleanor Vane was here, she said. She will speak to the legal counsel. Fenner prepared her for the interview specifically to ensure the search would fail. Nathaniel set down his pen. We have him, Abigail said. Something moved across his face. Something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but contained elements of both, along with something quieter and more private that she was beginning to learn to read. We have him, he agreed. She set the correspondence on his desk. She looked at him. He looked at her. The summer afternoon held them both in its long suspended light, and outside Boston was already talking, and Fenner was already managing his version of the story, and the family council, and the October deadline, and the legal proceedings were all in motion at once. And somewhere in all of it, Abigail Mercer, who had come to this house as a hired woman to solve a practical problem, was standing in the study of the man she had been falling in love with for 7 months, and the portfolio with the crossed-out names was locked in the library drawer, and the only name that had ever mattered was the one that neither of them had written down. Because some things she was beginning to understand did not need to be written. Some things you simply knew. Boston talked. Abigail had known it would. She had told Nathaniel it would, and Lydia had told her it would, and Eleanor Vane had confirmed it with the quiet authority of a woman who understood how this city moved information from one drawing room to the next, with the efficiency of a well-run postal service. She had known, and knowing had not made it easier. The first dinner invitation they accepted together was at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hargrove, one of the older merchant families in the city. People who had known the Whitcomb name for 2 generations, and whose opinion Lydia explained with careful precision, would either anchor Nathaniel's social standing through what was coming or accelerate the damage. Lydia had arranged the invitation herself. That more than anything else told Abigail how seriously the older woman had revised her initial position. "You will be observed," Lydia told Abigail that afternoon, in the particular tone she used when she was giving information she considered critical. "Every word you say, every expression you allow, every way you move through that room will be measured and discussed and remembered. You understand that?" "I understand it," Abigail said. "They will be looking for evidence that you are what they already believe you to be. A woman who used proximity and intelligence to position herself above her natural station." Lydia paused. "You are not that woman, but you will need to demonstrate it in a room full of people who have already decided otherwise." "I have been demonstrating my value in rooms full of people who had already decided otherwise since I was 19 years old," Abigail said. "I am accustomed to the work." Lydia looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I believe you are." She stood. "Wear the blue. It's more authoritative than the gray." Abigail almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The dinner was 30 people. Abigail counted them as they arrived because counting things was a habit she had never been able to break, and it gave her hands something to do while her face performed the composed pleasantness that Lydia had prescribed for the evening. 30 people, almost all of them connected to the major trading and banking families of Boston. Almost all of them looking at her with the particular attention of people who had already heard a story and were assessing whether the subject of it matched their expectations. She was introduced by Nathaniel simply as Miss Abigail Mercer. No qualifier. No explanation of their connection or her previous position in his household. Just her name said, with the quiet certainty of a man who considered it sufficient. Several of the introductions went smoothly. Mrs. Hargrove was gracious in the careful way of a woman who had decided to be neutral until she had more information which Abigail considered a reasonable position and treated accordingly. 2 of the men, present younger, involved in shipping contracts that overlapped with the Whitcomb estate's interests, spoke to her about the harbor trade, with the initial condescension of men who expected her not to know anything about it, and then with something closer to genuine interest when it became apparent that she did. She was managing it. She could feel herself managing it, and she could feel Nathaniel beside her, not hovering, not protective in the way that would have implied she needed protection, but present in the way of someone who was exactly where he intended to be. And then Silas Fenner walked in. She had not known he would be there. She looked at Nathaniel and saw by the brief tightening around his eyes that he had not known either. Fenner was there as someone else's guest, a man named Aldrich, a banking associate who had no direct connection to the Whitcomb legal proceedings. It was not Hargrove's fault. He could not have known. Fenner saw her immediately. She watched him see. Her watched his expression do its complicated work, the contempt layering over the fear, the calculation moving underneath both, and she kept her face completely still, and she thought he came here on purpose. He knew we would be here, and he came on purpose. "Miss Mercer." He said it carrying across a distance loudly enough for the people immediately around them to hear loudly enough to make it an announcement rather than a greeting. Still attending the Whitcomb family's social engagements, I see. How resourceful. The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped several degrees. Nathaniel turned his head. She put her hand briefly on his arm, not restraining him, just a touch, just the smallest possible signal, and she took one step forward. "Mr. Fenner," she said. Her voice was level and clear and entirely unhurried. "I was not aware you had been invited this evening. Given the current status of the legal proceedings, I imagine Mr. Hargrove will be similarly surprised." A murmur moved through the nearest cluster of guests. The word legal proceedings had done exactly what she intended it to do. Fenner's expression shifted. He had expected her to be flustered. She was not flustered. "Legal proceedings," he said with the performance of a man who found the suggestion absurd, brought on the basis of a secretary's misreading of accounts she was never qualified to analyze. "The family's legal counsel appears to disagree," Abigail said pleasantly. "As does Eleanor Vane, who I believe you know." The color left Fenner's face. She had not planned to say Eleanor's name here in this room in front of these people. But he had come here on purpose, and he had said it loudly, and she was not. She had told Lydia this, and she had told Nathaniel this, and she was telling it to herself now, with every steady beat of her heart. She was not a woman who stood quietly, while a frightened man tried to make her small. "You have no idea," Fenner said, and his voice had lost the performance of it now, "what you are doing. You have no idea what this family is, or what this city is, or what happens to women like you when they step outside the role they were given." "That's enough." Nathaniel's voice. Quiet. Absolute. The voice he used when a decision was final. He stepped forward. He stood beside Abigail, not in front of her, but beside her, which was the specific thing he did that she would remember for the rest of her life. And he looked at Fenner with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not fury. Something colder and more final than fury. "You will not speak to her that way," he said. "Not in this room, not in any room in this city. Not now, not after the proceedings are concluded, not ever. Do you understand me, Fenner?" The room was very still. Fenner looked at him. He looked at Abigail. He looked at the 30 people who were no longer pretending not to listen. He looked at the face of a man who had made a decision that was not going to be reversed, and at the woman standing beside that man, who looked everyone in that room would say this later in their various drawing rooms, with their various opinions, like she belonged exactly where she was. Fenner left. He walked out of the Hargrove dining room without another word, and the door closed behind him, and the room held its collective breath for exactly 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Hargrove said, "Well, shall we go in to dinner?" in the voice of a woman who had decided which side of history she wished to be on, and the evening resumed. Abigail stood very still for a moment after it resumed. She felt Nathaniel's hand find hers briefly, just a moment, just the press of his fingers, and then release because they were in company, and he was a man who observed certain proprieties. She thought he stood beside me. Not in front. Beside. That she thought was the whole of it. That was the thing she had been trying to articulate to herself for 2 weeks through all the practical considerations and careful objections and rational assessments. Not that he defended her. Not that he chose her. The way he stood. Beside, not in front. As though that was simply where he belonged. She went in to dinner. The meal itself was by any objective measure a success. Mrs. Hargrove spoke to Abigail for 20 minutes about the education of women, a subject on which Abigail had both strong opinions and considerable personal history, and by the end of it, Mrs. Hargrove had committed to attending a discussion that Abigail had not yet organized, but apparently was now going to. 2 of the shipping men continued their earlier conversation with her about harbor trade reform. An older woman named Mrs. Prescott, who had said nothing to Abigail on arrival, found her after supper and told her in a low voice and with the particular directness of someone who had stopped caring about social calculations several years prior. "Your father would be proud of you, I think. I knew Thomas Mercer. He was a good man." Abigail had to press her lips together for a moment. "You knew him?" "Years ago in Cambridge. He taught my youngest. Finest mind I encountered in a schoolroom." She paused. He had a daughter who he said was sharper than any of his students. I wondered what became of her. She became a secretary, Abigail said. And now, Mrs. Prescott asked. Abigail glanced across the room to where Nathaniel was speaking with Mr. Hargrove, and he looked up at that moment, the way he sometimes did, as though he felt her attention, and their eyes met briefly across the room. Now, Abigail said, I'm still figuring that out. Mrs. Prescott made a sound that might have been a laugh. Good answer, she said, and moved away. On the carriage ride home, Nathaniel sat across from her, and Lydia sat beside him, and for the first several minutes, no one said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Then Lydia said, Mrs. Hargrove will be useful. She was kind, Abigail said. She was strategic, Lydia corrected. Mrs. Hargrove is kind when kindness serves her interests, and strategic when it doesn't. Tonight kindness was strategic. That is fine. We take the kindness regardless of its origin. Nathaniel looked at Abigail. You handled Fenner well. I mentioned Eleanor's name before I had decided to, she said. I should have been more controlled. You were exactly as controlled as the situation required. He paused. Eleanor's name ended the conversation before it could do more damage. That was the right call. He came there on purpose, she said. I know. His voice was flat. The legal proceedings will move faster than he expected. He's trying to establish a narrative before the evidence is entered formally. Will it work? No. He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who had done his accounting. We have the documentation. We have Eleanor. We have 3 years of altered ledgers with his handwriting in the margins. He paused. He's panicking. Panicking men make poor strategists. Lydia said nothing, which was how Abigail knew she agreed with all of it. The carriage moved through the July night, and Boston moved past them outside, and Abigail sat with the evening settling over her, the weight of it, and the strange, unexpected warmth underneath the weight. And she thought about Mrs. Prescott saying your father would be proud of you, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone say that to her, in a room full of people who had arrived believing the worst of her. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she was not going to start in a carriage with Lydia Whitcomb, who had enough to revise her opinions about already. But it was close. 2 days later, the formal legal complaint against Silas Fenner was filed. The family's counsel, a careful, thorough man named Mr. Daniel Ames, who had reviewed every ledger and every piece of correspondence that Abigail had documented, and had added his own considerable professional judgment to the picture, presented a complete account to the appropriate court. Fraudulent alteration of accounts. Breach of fiduciary duty. The deliberate sabotage of a contractual search process supported by Eleanor Vane's testimony about the nature of Fenner's preparation of her candidacy. The filing was a matter of public record. Boston read it. The story shifted. Not completely. Not all at once. Not with any of the satisfying clarity of a wrong being. Simply and immediately righted. Social opinion did not move that way, and Abigail had never been naive enough to expect it to. But it shifted. The narrative Fenner had been building the secretary who maneuvered above her station. The wealthy man clouded by inappropriate attachment. The respectable family account damaged by an outsider's interference. That narrative lost its footing when the alternative narrative turned out to be documented and filed with the court. She had not misread the accounts. She had found the fraud. That was a different story. Mrs. Caroline Ashford, whose letter of concern to Lydia had started the social alarm 3 weeks ago, appeared at the house on a Thursday morning and spent an hour with Lydia in the east parlor, and when she left, she stopped in the hall where Abigail was crossing with correspondence, and she said with the particular composure of a woman revising her position without abandoning her dignity, Miss Mercer, I believe I owe you a more open mind than I initially extended. Abigail looked at her. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. I am not saying Boston will make this easy, Mrs. Ashford said carefully. Old opinions die slowly here, but I am saying that the picture is considerably more complicated than the first account suggested. It usually is, Abigail said, when a woman is involved. Mrs. Ashford looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face that might have been recognition. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose it usually is. She nodded and left. Abigail stood in the hall for a moment after she was gone. Then she went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the library, her library, the room that had always been hers in practice, even when it wasn't in title, and he was sitting at her desk, which he had never done before. He was reading something. He looked up when she came in. Mrs. Ashford came, she said. I know, Lydia told me. He paused. How was it? Cautious. Genuine, I think, underneath the caution. She sat down across from him, his chair the reading table chair he had pulled to her desk that first morning with the coffee. Sitting in each other's spaces without remarking on it. They had apparently been doing that for a while now. She said old opinions die slowly here. They do. She's right, he agreed. He set down what he was reading. He looked at her steadily in the way he had fully without apology, without the deflection that most men used when a conversation was about to cost them something. Abigail, I need to ask you something. She waited. The deadline, he said. October 14th. We have 10 weeks. I know. The legal proceedings will be well underway by then. The council seat that Fenner held is going to be challenged on the basis of his conduct. But the will itself. The will requires you to be married before your 38th birthday, she said. Yes, I drafted the summary document myself. He looked at her. She looked at him. The library held them in its particular summer stillness. All those books around them. The two desks occupying the room like a declaration neither of them had made in words. I am asking you, he said carefully. Not because of October. I want to be clear about that. The estate will survive without the will's conditions being perfectly met. Ames is confident we can challenge the council composition regardless of my marital status, given Fenner's conduct. He paused. I am asking because I have known since the second week of December what I wanted, and I have been conducting an elaborate pretense that I did not know, and I am no longer willing to pretend. She felt her heart move, steadily, like something that had been held in a closed hand and was being let out. December, she said. That was 2 weeks after you hired me. Yes. You knew in December. I knew there was something about you that made every other consideration seem secondary, he said. I did not have the clarity to name it correctly until considerably later. But yes, December. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about 7 months of lists and candidates and crossed out names. She thought about the pretense on her side, the careful professional distance she had maintained with such deliberate effort, the way she had told herself every morning that she was simply doing her job, the way she had looked at Eleanor Vane across a tea table and known. I knew in February, she said. Something in his face went very still. February. Mrs. Hartwell's interview, she said. You told me afterward that she spoke too little. I was writing it in the ledger and I thought he won't choose any of them. And then I thought, why do I know that? And then I knew. She paused. I told myself it was professional intuition. I was very committed to that explanation for quite some time. February, he said again, like a man recalibrating something. We lost 6 months. We were both very committed to our respective pretenses. We were, he said. He rose from her desk. He crossed to where she was sitting, and he stopped in front of her, and he offered her his hand. Not a romantic gesture, nothing theatrical about it. Just his hand extended toward her with the same directness he brought to everything, and she looked at it, and she looked at him. Abigail Mercer, he said. I am asking you plainly and honestly to marry me. Not in October, now, as soon as it can be arranged. Because I have spent 7 months being a fool about this, and I do not intend to spend another day of it. She put her hand in his. Yes, she said, simply. The way she had written it to herself in the portfolio on the blank page in the summer evening before she knew what she was answering. Then choose. She had chosen. He closed his hand around hers, and she felt the warmth of it move all the way through her, and she thought about her father, and about February, and about 7 crossed-out names, and about all the long months of being useful without being seen. And she thought, this is what it costs, and this is what it's worth, and I have done the accounting, and the numbers are honest. Lydia will want to be involved in the arrangements, she said. Lydia will insist on running the entire operation, he agreed. We should tell her soon before she decides something for us. This afternoon, Abigail said. This afternoon. He had not let go of her hand. Are you frightened? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. But the right kind of frightened. The kind that means the thing is real. He looked at her. And she saw it again, the loneliness behind the precision, but smaller now. Less like a room no one had ever entered. More like a room someone had just begun to learn the shape of. Good, he said quietly. Then we're both frightened together. She stood up. She was still holding his hand, and she kept holding it because she had spent too long being careful, and she was finished with that particular form of caution. Nathaniel, she said. We should also talk about what happens when we tell Boston. I know. They will have opinions. They will have many opinions, he said. They will share them loudly and at length. And then they will move on to the next thing, because Boston always moves on to the next thing. He paused. And we will still be here, working on the accounts. She thought about 2 desks in the library, 2 lamps in the summer dark, 2 people doing the same work in the same room with no pretense between them. Yes, she said. We will. Outside Boston was already talking. And somewhere across the city, Silas Fenner was reckoning with a narrative he could not control, and Mrs. Ashford was revising her opinions, and Eleanor Vane was preparing her testimony, and the old stories were beginning slowly, imperfectly, the way these things always moved to make room for the true one. And in the library of the Whitcomb house, 2 people stood holding hands in the summer afternoon and decided without saying it in so many words that they were done being afraid of what they already knew. They told Lydia that afternoon. Nathaniel found her in the east parlor, where she conducted most of her social correspondence, and he always knocked on Lydia's door, which was one of the things about him that Abigail had noted quietly and valued without saying so. And he came in with Abigail beside him, and he said without preamble, because Lydia had never responded well to preamble, "We are to be married, soon. I wanted you to know before we made any other arrangements." Lydia set down her pen. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at Abigail. She looked at their hands, which were not joined in that moment, but which carried in the way they stood close to each other without quite touching the evidence of someone who had been holding on. She said, "How soon?" "As soon as is practical," Nathaniel said. "Within the month if possible." Within the month. Lydia repeated it in the tone of a woman rapidly reorganizing a considerable number of internal calculations. "That is aggressive. We have been slow enough already," Nathaniel said. Lydia looked at Abigail. "And you are decided." "I am decided," Abigail said. Something moved across Lydia's face. It was not the warm approval of a woman who had always wanted this outcome. It was something more honest than that, the particular expression of a person revising a firmly held position and choosing to revise it with grace rather than resistance. "Then I have a great deal of work to do," Lydia said. She picked up her pen. "Close the door on your way out." Nathaniel looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Nathaniel. They left. In the corridor he said, "That went better than I expected." "She said within the month was aggressive," Abigail said. "For Lydia, that is enthusiasm." Abigail almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way it moved through her chest without warning, light and real and entirely unguarded. She pressed her lips together. He watched her do it with the expression he wore when she did something that he was filing away. "Don't suppress it," he said. "I'm not suppressing anything." "You were about to laugh and you stopped yourself." "I was being composed, Abigail." He looked at her steadily. "You do not have to be composed with me. You have never had to be composed with me. I simply did not know how to tell you that until recently." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 7 months of composure. 7 months of careful, deliberate, professional stillness. 7 months of holding everything at exactly the right distance. She let the laugh out. It was small and genuine, and entirely her own, and it moved through the corridor like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. And Nathaniel Whitcomb looked at her with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life learning to read and never entirely finish. "There," he said quietly. "That's the one." The wedding was 3 weeks later. Not small. Lydia had opinions about small, And those opinions were negative, but not large either. 40 people carefully selected in the house, rather than a church, because Abigail had asked for the house, and Nathaniel had immediately agreed without asking why. She knew why. This house was where it had happened. Every room of it had been part of the story. The church would have been ceremony. The house was the truth. Mrs. Prescott came. She brought a copy of a book that had belonged to Thomas Mercer, a volume of history that he had apparently lent her 20 years ago, and never asked back, which she had kept with the intention of returning it someday, and now pressed into Abigail's hands with something that might have been tears in the eyes of a woman who had stopped apologizing for her emotions many years prior. Abigail held the book against her chest and thought he would have liked this. He would have argued with Nathaniel about shipping economics and lost gracefully, and then come back the next morning with 3 additional points. Eleanor Vane came. She sat in the 3rd row, and she looked when Abigail passed her like a woman who had made peace with a particular chapter of her life and found the next one interesting. She caught Abigail's eye and gave a single composed nod. Abigail returned it. Mrs. Hargrove came. Mrs. Ashford came, which surprised Abigail more than it probably should have. The 2 shipping men who had talked harbor trade reform at the Hargrove dinner came with their wives, and one of the wives pulled Abigail aside before the ceremony began and said, "My husband has not stopped talking about the conversation you had about the harbor contracts. He says you understand the Eastern trade better than most of the men on the wharf committee." She paused. "I told him that was probably because you were not on the wharf committee and therefore did not have a professional interest in being wrong about things." Abigail looked at her with genuine pleasure. "That is an astute observation." "I have many of them," the woman said cheerfully. "No one asks for them. I give them anyway." Abigail thought, "I am going to like her." And the thought felt like the beginning of something she had not fully anticipated. Not just a marriage, not just a resolution to a problem, but a life. An actual life with actual people in it, built on something real. The ceremony itself was quiet and honest. The minister was a man Nathaniel had known for 20 years, old enough to dispense with performance and say the words as though he meant them, and expected the people in front of him to mean them too. When he asked if Nathaniel took this woman, Nathaniel said, "I do," with the same direct certainty he brought to everything, and Abigail believed every syllable of it. When the minister asked if Abigail took this man, she said, "I do," and felt the weight of it, the full, real, unromantic weight of a decision made with clear eyes and an honest heart. And she did not flinch from the weight, because she had never been a woman who flinched from honest weights. Nathaniel put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. She noted that. Lydia in the front row was perfectly composed. Abigail could see from the corner of her eye that Lydia's hands were pressed very tightly together in her lap. She noted that too. 3 days after the wedding, the first letter arrived from the family council. It was addressed to Nathaniel, but Abigail was in the study when it came, and he handed it to her without comment, because they had apparently already established in 72 hours of marriage that correspondence affecting the estate was correspondence affecting them both. She read it. She read it twice. She set it on the desk. "They're challenging this marriage," she said. "I expected they would try. Not the marriage itself, they cannot challenge the legal validity. They're challenging the timing." She looked at the letter again. "They're arguing that the marriage was arranged specifically to meet the terms of the will, rather than representing a genuine prior attachment, and that therefore the spirit of the will's requirement has not been met, and that the council's oversight role should be activated regardless." Nathaniel looked at the letter. His expression was the controlled fury one. "They have no standing for that argument." "They have Aldrich," she said. "He's a lawyer. He will find standing." She paused. "He was Fenner's guest at the Hargrove dinner." Nathaniel went very still. "Aldrich is part of it," she said. "Not the fraud itself. I don't think he has his hands in the ledgers, but he knew. He's been protecting Fenner's counsel position, because Fenner's counsel position serves Aldrich's interests." She looked at Nathaniel. "How long has Aldrich been on the family council?" 8 years. "And Fenner?" 10. She sat down. She pulled the account ledger from the stack on the desk. Not the Whitcomb ledger, but the council records, which she had quietly obtained through Ames 2 weeks ago, under the pretext of routine review, and she opened it to a section she had marked. "Look at this," she said. He came around the desk and stood beside her and looked. The council's discretionary fund. Small amounts consistently transferred to a secondary account over 8 years with notations that were vague to the point of meaninglessness. Abigail had looked at those notations 4 days ago and thought they were careless bookkeeping. She looked at them now in light of Aldrich's letter, and she saw something different. "They've been paying themselves," Nathaniel said quietly, "for 8 years. Out of the discretionary fund, which has no external auditing requirement because the council itself is the auditing body." She looked at him. Fenner wasn't working alone. He was the active instrument, but Aldrich built the structure that made it possible. The room was very quiet. "Ames needs to see this today," Nathaniel said. "I'll have it ready within the hour." She was already pulling paper toward her. "And Nathaniel, the letter from the council about the timing of our marriage." "Yes. They're going to argue it publicly. They're going to take the position that this was a strategic marriage rather than a genuine one, and they're going to use that argument to put sympathetic witnesses in front of whatever body agrees to hear it." She looked up at him. "Who in this city can speak to the fact that whatever we are, we have been becoming it since before October was a consideration?" He thought for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway. She's been in this house for 20 years. She has eyes. Mrs. Prescott knew my father and has watched us since the Hargrove dinner. Mrs. Hargrove herself." Abigail paused. "Eleanor." "Eleanor's testimony is already entered in the Fenner proceedings. Her testimony about Fenner, yes. Not her testimony about what she observed when she was brought here as a candidate." Abigail met his eyes. "She told me in the sitting room that she understood within 2 hours that whatever he was looking for, she was not it. That is testimony about the state of his affections in August. The council's letter argues that the marriage was arranged for October. Eleanor can speak to August." Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when she found the Savannah account discrepancy, and when she identified the pattern of the altered ledgers, and when she said Eleanor's name at the Hargrove dinner. The look that meant the picture had come clear. "You thought of all of that," he said, "in the time it took you to read that letter twice." "I thought of most of it." She picked up her pen. "I'm still working on Aldrich." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Warm, the same restraint and the same reality that had been present in every gesture between them since the beginning. "I'll go to Ames myself this morning." "Go," she said. "I'll have the documentation ready when you return." He left. She worked. The summer morning moved through the windows of the study, her study now as much as his and Abigail Whitcomb, who had been Abigail Mercer for 27 years and had spent 7 months of that time finding the right name for a list, bent over the council records and found what she was looking for. The council's challenge collapsed within a month. Not dramatically. Not with any of the satisfying public theater of a villain defeated in front of witnesses. Legal proceedings were rarely dramatic in the way stories made them, and Abigail had always known that, and she had prepared herself for the slow grinding work of documentation and testimony and formal process. She was good at slow grinding work. She had been doing it her whole life. Ames presented the council fund alterations. Eleanor gave a deposition about what she had observed in August. Mrs. Calloway testified with the quiet authority of a woman who had watched a household for 20 years and knew exactly what she had seen, that Mr. Whitcomb had been a different man since December, and that the December in question was some months prior to any October deadline. Mrs. Prescott wrote a letter at her own initiative that was precise and unambiguous and carried the weight of a woman with no personal investment in the outcome except the truth of it. Aldrich resigned his council seat before the formal findings were issued. The council was reconstituted with 3 new members, 2 of whom Abigail had researched herself and recommended to Ames on the basis of their professional records. Silas Fenner was formally found liable for fraudulent alteration of accounts and breach of fiduciary duty. The financial penalty was significant. His professional standing in Boston was effectively finished. The morning the final finding was issued. Nathaniel brought the letter to the library and set it on Abigail's desk and sat down in the reading chair across from her and said nothing. She read the letter. She set it down. It's done, she said. It's done, he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. The library was quiet around them, the particular quiet of that room, the one that had always felt like rest. How do you feel? She asked. He considered the question honestly, which was one of the things she had always valued about him. Relieved, he said, and angry that it was necessary, and, he paused. Grateful, for December, for the advertisement in the Sentinel, for whatever series of events put a schoolmaster's daughter with a ledger and better judgment than everyone around her in the chair across from my desk 8 months ago. She felt warmth move through her. She was getting better at not suppressing it. I was terrified at that interview. He looked genuinely startled. You were not. I was extraordinarily composed, she corrected. Those are different things. You corrected my phrasing in the first 10 minutes. You used an imprecise term. I noted it. I was still terrified. Something moved across his face that was so unguarded and warm that she had to look at the letter for a moment to recollect herself. I hired you because of that, he said. The correction. I had spoken to 11 candidates before you, and not one of them had corrected anything I said. He paused. I thought, here is a woman who tells the truth even when it costs her. I need that in this house. She looked back at him. You needed it in more rooms than the ledger room. I needed it everywhere, he said quietly. I needed someone to tell me the truth about everything. I had been running this estate and this life with excellent efficiency and no honesty for a very long time. She stood up. She came around the desk, her desk, his library, their room, and she stood in front of him and she said, Nathaniel. He looked up at her. We are going to build a school, she said. He blinked. Now, not today, but soon. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks since Mrs. Hargrove's wife had said the thing about the wharf committee, since Mrs. Prescott had told her about her father, since she had sat in the interview room with Eleanor Vane, and thought about all the women who passed through that kind of room and were used for other people's purposes and never offered a door of their own. For working women. In Cambridge, where my father taught. Basic accounting, estate management, correspondence, legal literacy. The things I taught myself because my father believed I was worth educating and no institution agreed. I was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this. I've been thinking about it. What's the difference? Planning requires resources and a willing partner. She looked at him steadily. I am now in possession of both. He rose from the chair. He was close to her now, the same close distance that had existed between them since that first morning with the coffee, the distance she had spent months maintaining and had since stopped measuring. A school, he said, and fair tenant contracts on the southern farms. I reviewed those last week. 3 of them are structured in ways that favor the estate heavily and give the tenants almost no protection in a bad harvest year. My father would have called that dishonest. Your father would have been correct. And the Fenner account recovery, when the financial penalty is collected, I think a portion of it should go toward the endowment. It's fitting. He looked at her with an expression that she had finally, after 8 months of study, learned to name correctly. It was not admiration exactly. It was something more specific than admiration. It was the look of a man who had spent years in rooms full of people and had found unexpectedly, and not by any plan, he had made the one person whose presence made the rooms make sense. You know, he said, when I crossed out the 7th name, I thought I had made a mess of everything. You had made a mess of everything, she said. I had. He did not look away from her. But it turned out to be the right mess. She put her hand on his chest over his heart, flat-palmed, the same way she pressed her hands against the ledger when she was steadying herself, and she felt his heartbeat under her hand, steady and real and entirely present. The right mess, she agreed. He covered her hand with his. They stood in the library with all those books around them and the summer winding slowly toward its end, outside and the whole of what they had built between them, not rescued, not arranged, not performed, but built, stone by stone, argument by argument, ledger by ledger, truth by truth, held in the particular quiet of that room. A year after that July morning, when the 7th name was crossed out, The Whitcomb School for Working Women opened in Cambridge, in a building 2 streets from where Thomas Mercer had taught his daughter everything she needed to know about being worth something in a world that preferred not to notice. The first class was 12 women. Their ages ranged from 19 to 41. 3 of them had never been taught to read a contract. 2 had been employed as domestic servants their entire adult lives and had no understanding of how wages were legally structured. 1 had been defrauded by an employer who had counted correctly on her not knowing enough to recognize it. Abigail taught the first class herself. Nathaniel sat in the back of the room for the first session. He did not say anything. He simply sat there with his hands folded and his complete attention on the woman at the front of the room. And when the session was over and the students had gone and Abigail was gathering her papers, he said, "Your father would have come every day." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She was getting better at not suppressing things, but some things still required a moment. "Yes," she said, "he would have." That evening they sat in the library. 2 desks, 2 lamps, the summer dark coming through the windows. He was working on the revised tenant contracts. She was reviewing the school's accounts, which she kept with the same careful precision she had always brought to numbers, because precision was not a habit she intended to abandon, simply because she no longer needed it for survival. The old portfolio was in the drawer. She had unlocked it once in the weeks after the wedding and looked at the 7 crossed-out names and the blank page with its 3 lines. What would you choose if you were not afraid? You already know. Then choose. She had looked at those 3 lines for a long time. Then she had turned to the last page, the very last blank page, and she had written something new. Not a name. Not a question. A fact. He crossed out 7 names. I let him cross out 6 before I understood why. We both wasted time, being afraid of the same thing. We are not wasting any more. She had locked the portfolio and put it back in the drawer, and she had not opened it again. She did not need to. The list was finished. The names were crossed out. The only name that had ever mattered had never been written on any page, because some truths were not the kind you committed to paper. They were the kind you committed to entirely with clear eyes and an honest heart, in a room full of books, in the long and ordinary light of a summer morning, that turned out to be the beginning of everything. Nathaniel reached across the space between the 2 desks and set a page beside her without comment. She looked at it. It was the first revised tenant contract reworked with the provisions she had suggested, balanced and fair and structured to protect both parties through a bad harvest year. She read it. She picked up her pen. She made 2 small notes in the margin. She passed it back. He read the notes. He nodded once. He made the adjustments. No grand speech. No performance. Just the work shared between 2 people who had chosen each other, not in spite of who they were, but entirely because of it. Outside Boston moved through its summer evening. The harbor was loud and ordinary and alive. The school in Cambridge sat waiting for its second session. The Whitcomb estate accounts were honest for the first time in a decade. The tenant farms had fair contracts. The women who had no one to teach them had somewhere to go. And in the library, where it had all begun, 2 lamps burned late into the night, side by side, steadfast and clear. Abigail Mercer had come to this house to write a list. She had written something better, a life built on honesty, chosen freely, earned, completely, and worth every crossed-out name that came before it. That was the truth, the whole of it. And it needed no list to prove it.